The city of Seattle was dying under a blanket of black fog. This was not the usual morning mist that the residents were used to. It was a thick, ink-colored vapor that rolled off the freezing Pacific Ocean and crawled through the streets like a living creature. It swallowed the tops of the skyscrapers and turned the bright neon signs of downtown into blurry, ghostly smudges of light. For Clara, the fog felt like a physical weight pressing against her narrow shoulders. It was cold, it was damp, and it felt like it was trying to erase her from existence. She stood under the rusted metal roof of a bus stop on the outskirts of the city. She pulled her thin gray coat tighter around her body, but it did nothing to stop the shivering that started deep in her bones. Her fingers were numb, but she did not dare put them in her pockets. In her right hand she clutched a single crumpled bus ticket, her very last one. In her left hand she held a piece of paper that was even more terrifying, an eviction notice. The ink was slightly smeared from the damp air, but the message was clear. She had 48 hours to pay the debt or leave the only home she had ever known. Her mind drifted back to the tiny one-room apartment she had just left. The air there was thick with the smell of damp wood and the sharp, medicinal scent of the cheap syrup she bought for her mother. Her mother was lying in the only bed they owned, her face as pale as the fog outside. Every few minutes, a deep, rattling cough would shake her mother's fragile frame, a sound that tore through Clara's heart like a sharp blade. They had no heat. They had no more medicine. And now, according to the paper in her hand, they had no more time. Clara had promised her mother she would find a way, but as she looked at the empty, fog-covered street, that promise felt like a heavy stone in her stomach. The bus arrived like a mechanical beast, its headlights cutting through the black fog like two angry yellow eyes. The doors opened with a heavy hiss of air, and Clara stepped into the dim, flickering light of the interior. The bus was nearly empty. A few tired workers sat with their heads against the windows, looking like shadows lost in their own thoughts. Clara sat at the very back, her eyes fixed on the window. She watched the city disappear as the bus climbed the winding roads toward the Gold Coast. This was the part of the state where the trees were ancient and the houses were hidden behind massive stone walls. This was the place where the billionaires lived in their silent fortresses, far away from the hunger and the noise of the city streets. As the bus reached the final stop, the driver did not even look at her. He simply opened the doors and waited. Clara stepped out into a world that felt completely different. Here, the pine trees were massive, their branches hissing in the cold wind like thousands of whispering voices. The black fog was even thicker here, moving between the trees like smoke from a dying fire. She began to walk, her boots crunching on the cracked pavement of the narrow road. The road led higher and higher toward the edge of the sea cliffs, where the roar of the ocean began to drown out the silence of the woods. Then through the darkness and the mist she saw it. The Blackwood Estate. It did not look like a place where people lived. It looked like a warning from a past century. The mansion was a massive structure built of dark, weathered stone that seemed to absorb the little light left in the sky. It had tall, sharp towers that pierced the fog like needles, and narrow windows that looked down on the world like cold, unblinking eyes. Surrounding the entire property was a fence of black iron, topped with spikes that looked like rows of sharpened teeth. Two massive stone pillars held up the heavy iron gate. On top of each pillar sat a lion, carved from gray marble. Their stone mouths were open in a silent roar, and in the darkness, it looked as if their eyes were following her every move. Clara reached out and touched the metal of the gate. It was so cold that it felt like it was burning her skin. She pushed with all her strength, and the metal gave a long, high-pitched scream that echoed through the empty grounds and deep into the woods. It was a sound so loud and so unnatural that it felt like the house itself was crying out in pain. As the gate swung open, every instinct in Clara's body told her to turn around and run. The air coming from the estate felt different. It was heavier, older, and carried the scent of wet stone and ancient dust. But then she pictured her mother's pale face in the dim light of their apartment. She felt the weight of the eviction notice in her pocket. She took a deep breath of the freezing air, ignored the fear rising in her throat, and stepped onto the gravel path. The walk to the front door felt like a journey into another world. The wind whistled through the stone carvings of the mansion, creating a haunting melody that seemed to speak her name. She reached the front door, a massive slab of black oak held together by heavy iron bolts. She took the iron knocker, which was shaped like a gargoyle's head, and struck the door 3 times. The sound was heavy and flat, vibrating through the wood and into her very bones. For a long time nothing happened. The only sound was the distant roar of the ocean crashing against the rocks 100 feet below the cliffs. Then, without a single sound of a lock turning, the door began to move. It opened slowly, retreating into the total darkness of the entrance hall. Clara stood on the threshold, her heart pounding against her ribs. She took one step inside, and the heavy door closed behind her with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. She was no longer in the city of Seattle. She was in the house of the Ice King, and the shadows were already beginning to close in. The heavy oak door did not just close, it seemed to seal the world away. As the latch clicked into place, the last bit of the Seattle fog was cut off, leaving Clara in a silence so thick it felt like water. The entrance hall of the Blackwood estate was a cavern of black marble and stretching shadows. There were no warm lights to welcome a guest, no soft rugs to muffle the sound of footsteps, and no photographs on the walls to suggest that a family had ever lived here. Everything was hard, cold, and polished to a mirror-like shine. The air inside didn't smell like a home. It smelled of ancient dust, expensive floor wax, and something sharp and metallic like the edge of a knife. Clara stood perfectly still, her heart echoing in the vast space. The floor beneath her boots was so dark and clean that she could see her own reflection looking up at her. A small, trembling girl in a wet coat, looking like a trespasser in a temple of stone. High above, a single chandelier hung from a ceiling lost in darkness. Its crystals did not sparkle. They hung like frozen tears, casting long, thin shadows that looked like bars of a cage across the walls. Then, from the darkness of the grand staircase, a figure began to descend. He moved with a silent, predatory grace that made the hair on the back of Clara's neck stand up. He didn't make a sound as he moved down the marble steps. This was Julian Blackwood. The world of business called him the Ice King, and standing in his presence, Clara finally understood why. He was tall and built with a lean, dangerous strength. He wore a black suit that was so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. His hair was the color of the midnight sky, and his face was a masterpiece of cold, sharp lines. But it was his eyes that truly froze the air in the room. They were a piercing, unnatural gray, the color of a frozen lake just before the ice breaks. They were eyes that didn't look at a person so much as they looked through them, searching for weaknesses and secrets. As he reached the bottom of the stairs and walked toward her, the temperature in the hall seemed to drop. He stopped exactly 5 feet away from her, his presence filling the space until Clara felt she might disappear entirely. He did not offer a hand to shake. He did not offer a smile. He stood with an absolute stillness that was unnerving. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant rumble that felt like it was vibrating through the floorboards. He didn't ask her name, he already knew it. He told her that in this house, time was the only currency he valued. He spoke of the Blackwood estate as if it were a living thing, a machine that required perfect order to function. Julian's gaze moved slowly over her, noting the frayed edges of her coat and the way her fingers clutched her small bag. There was no pity in his expression, only a cold, calculated observation. He informed her that his life was built on a foundation of silence and absolute privacy. He explained that his business required his mind to be free of distractions, and therefore her existence in the house must be almost invisible. She was to be a shadow among shadows, a ghost that kept the stone walls clean and the fire burning without ever being heard. The rules he laid out were simple but felt like iron chains. She was never to enter the east wing unless specifically told to do so. She was never to touch the items on his desk. She was never to speak to him unless he addressed her first. And then came the warning that stayed with her the longest. He pointed a long, pale finger toward the upper corridors, where dozens of heavy oak doors stood in a row. He told her that some doors in the Blackwood estate were locked for a reason, and curiosity was a luxury she could not afford. If he ever found her standing before a door that was meant to stay shut, her employment would end that very second, and she would be cast back into the fog without a penny. Clara swallowed the fear that was rising in her throat. She thought of the medicine her mother needed. She thought of the cold apartment and the eviction notice. She looked into Julian's ice-gray eyes and promised him that she was not there to ask questions. She told him she was there to work, to follow his rules, and to earn her place. For a split second, something flickered in Julian's gaze, not warmth, but a spark of recognition. He saw the desperation in her, and he knew that desperate people were the most loyal. Without a word of goodbye or a gesture of welcome, he turned his back on her. He walked back toward the staircase, his long black coat trailing behind him like the shadow of a great bird. He told her that her room was in the attic, the only place where the sun might reach if the fog ever cleared. He instructed her to find the kitchen and begin her duties at 4 o'clock the following morning. His final order was about his coffee. It was to be black, as dark as the night outside, and left at his study door in total silence. As he disappeared into the darkness of the upper floors, Clara was left alone in the freezing silence of the hall. The massive mansion felt as though it were leaning in on her, its stone walls heavy with 100 years of secrets. She was inside the fortress of the Ice King. She had the job that would save her mother's life, but as she looked at the dark marble floor and the towering shadows, she realized that the price of her survival might be living in a world where the sun never rose and the silence never ended. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and began her long walk toward the back of the house, leaving the screaming gate and the black fog behind her, and entering a new kind of darkness. The first morning at the Blackwood estate began long before the sun had even thought of rising. In the tiny freezing room in the attic, the air was so cold that Clara could see her own breath as she sat up in bed. The silence of the mansion was different at 4 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, expectant one, as if the stone walls were waiting for her to make a mistake. She dressed quickly in the simple dark uniform that had been left for her, her fingers fumbling with the buttons because of the cold. She thought of her mother back in the city, and used that thought to push herself out of the room and down the narrow, creaking stairs. The kitchen was a vast, stainless steel desert. It was modern but completely lifeless. There were no smells of baking bread or fresh fruit. It smelled only of cold metal and cleaning chemicals. Clara found the coffee machine, a high-end device that looked as complicated as a piece of laboratory equipment. She followed the instructions Julian had given her with perfect care. She ground the beans until they were as fine as dark sand and brewed the coffee until the liquid was so dark it looked like liquid onyx. When the pot was ready, she poured the steaming coffee into a white porcelain cup. The contrast between the dark liquid and the white cup was sharp, like everything else in this house. She placed the cup on a silver tray and began the long walk up the grand staircase. The marble was slick under her feet, and the flickering light of the single chandelier made the shadows move along the walls. When she reached the door to Julian's study, she hesitated. She remembered his warning. Do not knock. Do not speak. She placed the tray on a small table outside the door. Her hand hovered near the wood for a second, wanting to knock just to confirm someone was actually inside, but she pulled back. She turned and walked away, her footsteps disappearing into the thick rugs of the hallway. An hour later, when she returned to check, the tray was still there, but the cup was empty. There was no sign of Julian, no sound from behind the door, just the cold white porcelain sitting in the dark. This became the rhythm of her life. But the work she was assigned was not the typical cleaning of a grand home. Julian did not care about the main dining room or the grand ballroom where guests would normally be received. Instead, he gave her a list of rooms in the West Wing, the parts of the mansion that felt as though they had been forgotten by time itself. Julian called it the shadow work. These were rooms that were buried deep within the house, far away from any windows. To reach them, Clara had to walk through long, narrow corridors where the air was thin and smelled of old paper and drying wood. When she opened the doors to these rooms, she was met with a wall of gray dust. Everything was covered in heavy, white sheets. In the dim light of her flashlight, the furniture looked like a graveyard of ghosts, frozen in time. Her task was to remove the sheets, one by one, and scrub every inch of the wood and stone beneath. It was exhausting, lonely work. She spent hours on her knees, scrubbing floors that hadn't seen a human footprint in 20 years. She polished heavy silver mirrors that were so tarnished they didn't reflect her face, only a dark, distorted version of the room behind her. As she worked, she felt a constant sense of unease. The mansion felt like it was watching her, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a whisper in a language she didn't understand. Julian remained a ghost in his own home. He never joined her for a meal, and he never checked on her progress. The only way she knew he was there was the empty coffee cup and the occasional sound of a door closing in the distance. However, on the third night, as she was returning from the West Wing, she noticed a sliver of light coming from the study door. It hadn't been closed all the way. Clara knew she should keep walking. She knew the rules. But the silence of the house was so suffocating that she found herself needing to see another human being, even if it was the man who called himself the Ice King. She slowed her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs, and looked through the narrow crack in the door. Julian was sitting at his massive desk. The only light in the room came from a single green lamp that cast long, distorted shadows across his pale face. He was leaning forward, his focus so intense that he looked like he was carved from stone. In front of him were sheets of paper, but they were not the white pages of a normal ledger. They were solid black, as dark as the Seattle fog outside. He held a silver pen in his hand, and as Clara watched, he began to write. The silver ink looked like liquid moonlight against the black paper. His hand moved with a strange, frantic energy, his writing sharp and aggressive. He wasn't just taking notes, he was pouring something onto those pages. A confession, a history, or perhaps a warning. Every few minutes he would stop, stare at what he had written with a look of profound sadness, and then turn the page to start again. He looked like a man trapped in a conversation with the dead. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house. Who was this man writing to? Why were the pages black? She thought of the stories she had heard in the city, about the Blackwood family's dark past and the tragedies that had left Julian alone in this stone fortress. She realized that Julian Blackwood wasn't just a cold billionaire. He was a man who lived in the shadows by choice, because perhaps the light was too painful for him to bear. She pulled back from the door and hurried toward the stairs, her breath coming in short gasps. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, a glimpse behind the curtain of the Ice King's life. As she climbed the stairs to her attic room, she looked out the small window. The black fog of Seattle was pressing against the glass, thick and impenetrable. Inside the house, the silence returned, heavier than before. Clara realized that she was no longer just a housekeeper in a mansion. She was a witness to a mystery that was deeper and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She lay in her bed, the image of the silver ink on black paper burned into her mind, knowing that in the Blackwood estate, even the words were written in the dark. The week continued with a heavy, unnatural stillness. The black fog of Seattle had become so thick that the world outside the mansion's windows had completely vanished. It was as if the Blackwood estate had been lifted off the earth and placed into a void where time didn't exist. Inside, Clara moved through the halls like a clockwork doll, her hands constantly moving, scrubbing and polishing. But no matter how much she cleaned, the house felt heavy with a coldness that no heater could touch. On the seventh day the atmosphere changed. It started with a sound, not the screaming of the gate, but a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the very stones of the mansion. Clara was assigned to clean the grand gallery, a long, narrow hall that connected the west wing to Julian's private quarters. This hall was different from the rest of the house. It wasn't filled with dusty furniture or covered in white sheets. It was empty, except for a single object sitting on a pedestal of black marble in the very center of the room. It was the crimson vase. In a house defined by shadows, black marble, and silver ink, the vase was a shock to the senses. It was made of deep, blood-red glass that seemed to glow from within, even in the dim light. Its surface was etched with gold patterns that looked like dancing flames or ancient vines. It was the only piece of true color Clara had seen since she entered the estate, and it felt dangerously beautiful. It was a relic of a time when the Blackwood family still knew the meaning of warmth. Clara approached the pedestal with a sense of reverence. She held her cleaning cloth tightly, her heart beating a little faster. She knew that this object was precious. It was more than just glass and gold, it was a memory. As she reached up to wipe a thin layer of dust from the rim of the vase, she felt a sudden, sharp chill in the air. The floor beneath her boots was polished to a lethal shine. Perhaps it was a stray drop of water from her bucket, or perhaps the house itself was playing a trick on her. As she shifted her weight to reach a higher spot, her foot slipped. It happened in slow motion. Her bucket tipped over, sending soapy water across the black marble. Clara's arms flailed as she tried to catch her balance, but her elbow struck the side of the marble pedestal. The heavy stone base wobbled, and the crimson vase began to tilt. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She lunged forward, her fingers brushing the cold air where the vase had been a second before. She closed her eyes, waiting for the sound of 1,000 red shards shattering against the floor, the sound of her life and her mother's future breaking into pieces. But the sound never came. When she opened her eyes, she saw a blur of black fabric. Julian Blackwood had appeared as if from the shadows themselves. He was on his knees, his body twisted in a desperate, athletic move. His hands were wrapped firmly around the base of the crimson vase, holding it just an inch above the hard marble floor. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was Clara's ragged breathing and the drip of water hitting the floor. Julian's face was inches from the stone, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. He slowly stood up, placing the vase back onto the pedestal with a trembling hand. It was then that Clara saw the price of his rescue. In his rush to save the vase, Julian had struck his hand against the jagged, unpolished edge of the marble pedestal. A deep, ugly gash ran across the palm of his right hand. The blood was immediate and startlingly bright. It was the same shade as the vase, a deep, visceral red. It began to drip steadily, staining the white cuff of his expensive shirt and pooling on the black floor. Julian didn't gasp. He didn't curse. He simply stared at his hand with a look of detached shock, as if he couldn't understand why his body was leaking color. "Mr. Blackwood," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "You're bleeding." You're badly hurt." Julian looked at her, his gray eyes wide and glassy. The mask of the Ice King was cracked. For the first time he looked vulnerable, like a man who had forgotten that he was made of flesh and bone instead of stone and silver. He tried to pull his hand away, his voice a hoarse, weak shadow of its usual self. "It is nothing," he said, though his knees buckled slightly. "Go back to your work, Clara. Clean this mess." "No," Clara said. Her voice was firm, a strength coming over her that she didn't know she possessed. "You saved the vase, but you didn't save yourself. Sit down." Julian was too weak to argue. He sank onto the edge of a nearby stone bench, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Clara looked around frantically. She had no bandages and the kitchen was too far away. She needed something to stop the heavy flow of blood. She reached up to her neck and untied her red scarf. It was old and the edges were frayed, but it was clean and made of soft, thick wool. It was the only thing she had left that belonged to her life before the fog, a gift from her mother when things were still good. She knelt before the billionaire, the man who had treated her like a shadow, and took his freezing hand in hers. His skin was like ice, but his blood was hot, soaking into the wool of her scarf instantly. Julian watched her with an expression of pure bewilderment. He didn't move as she began to wrap the fabric around his palm. "Why are you doing this?" Julian asked. The question was quiet, stripped of all its usual coldness. "I have been nothing but a ghost to you. I have given you nothing but silence and orders." Clara didn't look up as she tied a careful, firm knot. "In the world I come from, Mr. Blackwood, people look after each other because no one else will. You saved something beautiful today. That tells me there is still something inside you that isn't made of ice." She finished the bandage. The red scarf was now a deep, dark crimson, matching the vase and the blood. It looked out of place against his black suit, a bright, warm reminder of life in a house of the dead. Julian looked down at his hand, then at the girl kneeling before him. The silence in the grand gallery changed. It was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of two people who had finally recognized each other in the dark. For a fleeting second, the gray in Julian's eyes seemed to soften, turning from the color of a frozen lake to the color of a morning mist. "Thank you, Clara," he whispered. It was the first time he had used her name without an order attached to it. Clara stood up, her legs feeling weak. She looked at the crimson vase, sitting safely on its pedestal, and then at the man whose life was written on black pages. She realized that the incident hadn't just broken the silence. It had broken a barrier. She was no longer just a housekeeper, and he was no longer just a king. But as she looked at the blood on the floor, she felt a cold shiver. The red scarf was a promise of healing, but the crimson vase was a relic of a past that held many more secrets. She didn't know yet that this moment of connection was the spark that would set the rest of the mansion on fire. She only knew that as she walked away to find a mop, the Ice King was still watching her, his hand wrapped in her red scarf, his eyes searching for a light that had been missing for 20 years. The days following the incident with the crimson vase were filled with an atmosphere that was hard to describe. The black fog of Seattle continued to press against the mansion, but inside the air felt different. Julian Blackwood was still the same silent, distant man, but he was no longer a complete mystery to Clara. Every morning when she left the black coffee outside his door, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. He was still wearing her red scarf. He hadn't replaced it with a professional bandage and he hadn't thrown it away. The bright, worn fabric was wrapped around his palm every time she caught a glimpse of him, a single splash of honest color against his expensive, dark world. Her work moved into the deeper sections of the mansion's east wing. This was a place Julian had previously told her to avoid, but the dust there had become so thick it was beginning to drift into the main hallways. He had given her a heavy iron key with a sharp, cold nod, telling her to clean only the floors and the windows, and to leave everything else exactly as she found it. The east wing felt older than the rest of the house. The wood of the walls was darker, and the ceilings were so high they were lost in a permanent shadow. It felt like a part of the house that was holding its breath, waiting for someone to wake it up. Clara reached the end of a long, narrow corridor and found a door that was different from the others. It was made of solid oak, but it was reinforced with iron bars, looking more like a vault than a bedroom. Her hand trembled as she turned the key. The lock groaned, a heavy metallic sound that echoed through the empty hallway. As the door swung open, she was met with the smell of linseed oil, turpentine, and very old dust. The room was a private gallery, but it was a graveyard of art. Dozens of frames were stacked against the walls, but they were all turned inward, hiding their faces from the world. In the center of the room, standing under a skylight that was completely obscured by the black fog outside, was a massive object. It was nearly 10 feet tall, sitting on a heavy wooden easel. It was covered by a thick, heavy black cloth, a veil that looked like it was made of funeral velvet. Clara knew she should start with the floors. She knew she should focus on the windows and stay away from the objects. But the black cloth seemed to pull at her. It was the only thing in the room that felt like it was hiding something important. In a house of black pages and silver ink, this hidden giant felt like the source of all the shadows. She walked toward the easel, her boots silent on the thick dust of the floor. She reached out and touched the velvet. It was cold and heavy, feeling like the skin of a dark animal. She hesitated, remembering Julian's warning about curiosity. But then she thought about the man who had saved a vase while his own hand bled. She thought about the sadness she had seen in his gray eyes. She took a corner of the cloth in her hand and pulled. The velvet slid off with a soft, heavy sound, falling to the floor like a dark cloud. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She didn't see a dark secret or a horrific image. Instead, she saw light. The painting was a masterpiece of warmth and color, so bright that it seemed to illuminate the dark room. It was a family portrait, painted in a style that captured every detail of the subject's souls. In the center of the painting stood a younger Julian Blackwood. He was perhaps 20 years old, his face full of life and a kind of hope that Clara had never seen on him. He wasn't wearing a black suit. He was in a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, standing in a garden filled with golden sunlight. His eyes weren't the color of a frozen lake. They were a soft, warm gray, crinkled at the corners with a genuine smile. Next to him stood his parents. His father was a tall, powerful man with a hand resting proudly on Julian's shoulder. His mother was a woman of incredible beauty, her eyes filled with a deep, maternal love that seemed to radiate from the canvas. They looked like a family that knew no sorrow, a family that believed the sun would never set on their happiness. The background was filled with flowers, blue skies, and the very mansion they were standing in. But in the painting, the Blackwood estate looked like a palace of light instead of a fortress of shadows. Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. She realized now why the house was so cold. It wasn't because Julian was a heartless man, it was because he was a broken one. He had lost this world. He had lost the sunlight, the laughter, and the people who looked at him with that kind of love. The black pages he wrote on weren't a choice. They were his reality. He was trying to live in a world where the color had been forcibly bled out. She looked closer at the bottom of the painting. There, written in gold ink, was a date from 25 years ago and a short phrase, "Before the shadow." Suddenly, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Clara turned around, her heart jumping in her chest. Julian was standing in the doorway. He was perfectly still, his silhouette framed by the dark hallway behind him. His hand, still wrapped in her red scarf, was clenched into a fist at his side. He didn't yell. He didn't move. He just stared at the painting, his face a mask of absolute, agonizing pain. It was the look of a man who was seeing a ghost, a man who was being forced to remember a dream he had tried very hard to forget. "I told you," Julian said, his voice a low, broken whisper. "I told you not to look behind the curtain." "Mr. Blackwood, I'm so sorry," Clara stammered, reaching for the velvet cloth to cover the painting again. "I didn't mean to, it was an accident." "Leave it," Julian snapped, his voice suddenly sharp as a razor. He walked into the room, his eyes fixed on the painted faces of his parents. He stopped in front of the canvas, his tall frame trembling. "Do you see them, Clara? Do you see how they looked? They believed the world was a kind place. They believed that wealth could protect them from the dark." He reached out his bandaged hand, his fingers hovering just inches away from his mother's face in the painting. "The fog didn't just come to Seattle, Clara. It came for us. In a single night, the light was extinguished and I was left alone in this tomb. You think I am cold? You think I am made of ice? I am simply a man who is trying to survive the winter that never ends." Clara stepped toward him, her fear replaced by a profound, aching sympathy. "You don't have to live in the dark, Julian. You saved the vase. You're wearing the scarf. There is still light in you, even if you've tried to hide it under black pages." Julian turned to look at her. For the first time he didn't look like the Ice King. He looked like the boy in the painting, lost, alone, and searching for a way home. But before he could speak, the silence of the mansion was shattered by a sound that didn't belong there. It was the aggressive, high-pitched whine of a sports car racing up the driveway, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of the iron gate being forced open. Julian's face instantly hardened. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. "He is here," Julian whispered, his voice full of a deep, ancient hatred. "The one who turned the lights out. The one who wants to finish what the shadows started." He grabbed Clara's arm, his grip firm but not hurtful. "Go to the kitchen. Lock the door. Do not come out until I call for you. Sebastian has arrived, and he does not come for a visit. He comes for blood." Clara watched as Julian turned back to the painting one last time. He reached down and picked up the black velvet cloth, throwing it back over the image of his happy family. The room returned to darkness, the sunlight of the past hidden once again under a funeral veil. As Julian walked out of the room to face his enemy, Clara realized that the secret discovery of the painting wasn't just a glimpse into his past. It was a warning. The villain of the story had arrived, and the battle for the Blackwood estate was no longer about cleaning floors or writing on black pages. It was about survival. The atmosphere inside the mansion changed the moment Sebastian stepped across the threshold. If Julian Blackwood was the cold, silent ice of a winter night, his cousin Sebastian was the oily, flickering heat of a guttering candle. He did not wait for an invitation. He did not knock. He shoved the heavy oak doors open with a violence that made the crystal chandelier high above rattle in the darkness. Sebastian was younger than Julian, but he carried a look of exhaustion that came from a life of greed and excess. He was dressed in a suit that was too bright and too expensive for the Seattle fog, a sharp electric blue that seemed to scream against the muted tones of the Blackwood estate. His blonde hair was slicked back with too much gel, and his smile was a jagged line that never reached his eyes. He smelled of expensive cologne and cheap cigarettes, a scent that felt like a stain on the clean, cold air of the hall. He walked into the center of the marble floor, his polished Italian shoes clicking with a rhythmic arrogance. He looked around the entrance hall not with admiration, but with the eyes of a man counting his profits. He touched the black marble pillars as if he were checking the price of the stone. When his gaze finally landed on Julian, who stood at the top of the grand staircase, his smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect. Julian descended the stairs slowly, his hand, still wrapped in Clara's red scarf, gripping the railing. He didn't say a word until he reached the bottom floor, standing like a shadow in front of his cousin. The contrast was absolute. Julian was a monolith of stone and silence. Sebastian was a whirlwind of fake charm and hidden daggers. Sebastian began to speak, his voice high and mocking. He called Julian his favorite cousin, his voice dripping with an insincerity that made Clara, who was watching from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, feel a cold shiver of disgust. Sebastian spoke of the family name and the weight of the Blackwood legacy. He talked about the downtown towers, the shipping docks, and the vast acres of the estate as if they were already his. He mentioned the board of directors and the rumors circulating in the city. Rumors that Julian had finally lost his mind, that the Ice King was melting away in his dark fortress. Julian's response was a wall of ice. He told Sebastian to leave, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He reminded his cousin that he had been banned from the property years ago for his gambling and his lies. But Sebastian only laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of heavy, cream-colored papers. These were not just ordinary documents. Sebastian claimed they were a new addition to their grandfather's will, a document that had been discovered in a private vault. According to these papers, the entire Blackwood fortune was to be transferred to Sebastian if Julian was ever deemed mentally or physically unable to manage the estate. Sebastian pointed a trembling finger at Julian's bandaged hand, mocking the injury and the peasant's rag he was using as a bandage. He called Julian a ghost who was haunted by the past, a man who preferred the company of shadows over the reality of the business world. Clara watched as Julian's face turned a shade of pale that was almost translucent. He knew the documents were a lie. He knew his grandfather would never have trusted a man like Sebastian with a single cent of the legacy. But as Sebastian held the papers closer to the light, Clara noticed something that made her breath hitch. At the bottom of the final page was a signature. It looked exactly like the sharp, aggressive silver lines she had seen Julian writing on his black pages. It was a perfect match, yet it felt wrong. It was too perfect, too deliberate. She remembered the silver pen she had seen Julian using, and the way his hand had trembled with the weight of his memories. The signature on the paper didn't have that soul. It was a cold, calculated imitation. Sebastian wasn't just there to argue. He was there to steal. He had spent months, perhaps years, studying Julian's handwriting, practicing every curve and every sharp edge until he could recreate it in his sleep. He had forged the will, and he had forged the signatures of the witnesses. He was using Julian's own isolation against him. Because Julian never saw anyone, and because he lived like a hermit, no one would be able to prove that he hadn't signed those papers in a moment of weakness or madness. The conflict escalated as Sebastian moved closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. He told Julian that the police were already on standby. He claimed that he had medical experts ready to testify that Julian's obsession with the shadow work and the black pages was proof of a fractured mind. He offered Julian a way out, a small monthly allowance and a quiet room in a private facility, provided he signed the transfer of power peacefully. If not, Sebastian promised to drag the Blackwood name through the mud of every courthouse in the country. Julian took a step forward, his eyes burning with a gray fire that Clara had never seen before. He didn't argue about the money or the towers. He spoke of his father. He spoke of the man in the painting who had built the legacy with his own sweat and blood. He told Sebastian that he would rather burn the mansion to the ground than see it fall into the hands of a thief. Sebastian's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, concentrated hate. He realized that Julian wouldn't be broken by words alone. He packed the papers back into his briefcase, his movements sharp and angry. He told Julian to enjoy his final night in the House of Shadows. He warned him that by tomorrow evening the locks would be changed, the Ice King would be in a cage, and the Blackwood estate would finally belong to someone who knew how to spend its gold. As Sebastian turned on his heel and walked back out into the black fog, the heavy doors slammed shut with a sound like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Julian stood in the center of the hall, his head bowed, his bandaged hand shaking at his side. He looked like a man who was watching his entire world crumble. Clara stepped out from the shadows, her heart breaking for the man who was too proud to ask for help. She saw a small scrap of paper on the floor, a practice sheet that must have fallen from Sebastian's briefcase. On it were dozens of attempts to copy Julian's signature, some crossed out, some circled in red ink. It was the proof of the crime, a small white slip of paper that held the key to the entire conspiracy. She looked at Julian, who was staring up at the grand staircase as if he were seeing the ghosts of his past. She realized that the shadow work wasn't just a job anymore. It was a battle. Sebastian had the law, he had the forged papers, and he had the power of the world outside the fog. All Julian had was a house of secrets and a housekeeper who had seen the truth. Clara gripped the scrap of paper tightly in her hand, her mind already racing. The villain had made his move, and the conflict was no longer a hidden secret within the walls. It was a war, and Clara Vance was the only one who could stop the ice from finally shattering. The night of the arrest did not arrive with a warning. It came with the sound of a storm that had no rain. The black fog of Seattle had become so thick that it felt as though the mansion was no longer on solid ground, but floating in a void of ink and cold air. Inside the Blackwood estate, the silence was different. It was no longer the quiet of a peaceful home. It was the suffocating stillness that comes before a disaster. Clara was in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she held the small scrap of paper she had found, the evidence of Sebastian's forgery. She had intended to find Julian and show him the truth, but the house felt too heavy tonight. Every shadow seemed to be leaning toward her, and every creak of the floorboards felt like a footstep following her. Before she could gather her courage, the darkness outside was shattered. Bright, aggressive flashes of red and blue light cut through the black fog, dancing like ghosts against the stone walls of the mansion. The rhythmic wail of sirens grew louder, drowning out the sound of the ocean. Clara ran to the front window, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 police cars had raced up the driveway, their tires spitting gravel as they skidded to a halt. Behind them was the sleek, electric blue car belonging to Sebastian. The heavy oak doors were not open this time, they were forced. The sound of the lock snapping was like a bone breaking in the silence. 4 police officers rushed into the entrance hall, their heavy boots leaving muddy streaks on the black marble floor that Clara had spent hours polishing. Behind them walked Sebastian, his face a mask of false concern and hidden triumph. He carried himself with the air of a man who had already won. Julian appeared at the top of the grand staircase. He stood perfectly still, his tall frame framed by the darkness of the upper floor. He was dressed in his usual black suit, and the red scarf Clara had tied around his hand was still there, a bright, honest stain against the coldness of his attire. He did not ask why they were there. He did not look surprised. He looked down at the chaos with a profound, weary sadness, as if he had expected the world to eventually come for him. Sebastian stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at his cousin. He spoke to the lead officer in a voice that was too loud and too dramatic. He claimed that Julian had finally snapped, that he was a danger to himself and the family legacy. He presented the forged will, the heavy cream-colored papers that supposedly proved Julian had signed away his rights in a moment of madness. He spoke of hidden accounts and stolen funds, weaving a web of lies so thick that it felt like the very air in the room was being poisoned. The lead officer looked at Julian and commanded him to come down with his hands visible. Julian descended the marble steps slowly, his movements graceful and silent even as the world collapsed around him. When he reached the bottom, he was not met with questions or a chance to explain. He was met with the cold, hard weight of metal. One of the officers grabbed Julian's arm, the one wrapped in the red scarf, and twisted it behind his back. Julian winced but did not cry out. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was final, a sharp metallic ring that echoed through the vast hall. Clara watched from the shadows of the kitchen, her breath caught in her throat. She saw the way they handled him, pushing the billionaire against the cold marble wall as if he were a common criminal. Sebastian leaned in close to Julian's ear, his voice a low, oily hiss that only Julian and Clara could hear. He told Julian that the Ice King was finally in a cage. He promised that by the time Julian saw the sun again, the Blackwood name would be a memory and the estate would be sold for parts. He laughed, a dry and hollow sound, as the officers began to drag Julian toward the open door. "You're making a mistake." Clara finally found her voice, stepping out into the light. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were burning with a desperate fire. "He didn't sign those papers. I have proof. Sebastian is lying." Sebastian turned to look at her, his eyes cold and dangerous. He gave the officers a knowing look, suggesting that Clara was simply a confused girl who had been manipulated by a madman. He told her to stay silent if she valued her freedom. One of the officers moved toward her, telling her to stay back and not interfere with police business. Julian turned his head as he was being dragged through the threshold. The black fog was swirling into the hall, swallowing the light. He looked at Clara, and for a fleeting second, the mask of ice was gone. In his gray eyes there was a message, a silent plea not for his own life, but for the truth. He looked at her with a trust that he had never shown another living soul. Then he was pulled into the darkness. Clara stood on the stone steps of the mansion, watching as the police cars sped away, their red and blue lights fading into the thick Seattle fog. The silence that returned to the estate was terrifying. Sebastian remained behind for a moment, standing in the center of the hall as if he were already the king of the castle. He looked at Clara with a sneer, telling her she had 10 minutes to pack her things and leave before he had her arrested for trespassing. He turned and walked toward Julian's study, his boots clicking with an arrogant rhythm on the marble. Clara did not move. She did not cry. She stood in the center of the freezing hall, her gaze fixed on the spot where Julian had been handcuffed. She looked down at the small scrap of paper in her hand, the practice sheet of forged signatures. It was a small weapon, but in the right hands it could be lethal. Something changed inside Clara in that moment. The girl who had arrived at the mansion with nothing but a bus ticket and a sick mother was gone. The fear that had lived in her heart for weeks was replaced by a cold, hard resolve that was sharper than any winter wind. She looked up at the dark towers of the mansion, and then toward the path leading to the city. She wasn't going to pack her things. She wasn't going to run away. She was going to become the shadow that Sebastian never saw coming. She thought of the red scarf that Julian was still wearing, a symbol of the blood they had both shed in this house. She realized that the Blackwood estate was no longer just a place of work. It was a battlefield. "You think you won, Sebastian?" Clara whispered into the darkness. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was as cold and steady as the marble beneath her feet. "But you forgot one thing. I spent my life surviving in the dark. And now, I'm going to make sure the darkness is the only thing you have left." She turned and slipped into the shadows of the West Wing, moving with a silent grace she had learned while cleaning the forgotten rooms. She knew the secret passages. She knew the hidden corners. Sebastian might own the papers, but Clara Vance owned the secrets of the house. As the first light of a gray morning began to struggle through the black fog, the hunt had officially begun. The housekeeper was no longer a victim. She was the avenger of the Blackwood name. The black fog of Seattle had moved from the cliffs of the mansion to the industrial heart of the city. Down at the old shipping docks, the air was thick with the smell of rusted iron, rotting wood, and the salty, freezing spray of the Pacific Ocean. This was the birthplace of the Blackwood fortune, a place of giant metal skeletons and silent warehouses that had once been filled with gold and trade. Tonight it looked like a graveyard. The streetlights were dim, flickering ghosts in the mist, and the only sound was the rhythmic, mournful slap of dark water against the wooden pilings of the pier. Clara moved through the shadows of the docks like a whisper. She had managed to follow Sebastian's electric blue sports car by clinging to the back of a delivery truck and then running through the narrow, oil-slicked alleyways. Her lungs burned with the cold air, and her boots were soaked through with icy water, but she felt no pain. The fire of revenge that had started in the mansion's hall was now a steady, freezing flame inside her. She was no longer the girl with the last bus ticket. She was the witness that the shadows had produced to tell the truth. She saw the flash of blue light as Sebastian parked his car behind Warehouse 47. This was one of the oldest buildings on the docks, a massive, windowless structure made of corrugated metal that had turned brown with decades of salt and rust. Above the heavy sliding doors, a faded sign still read, "Blackwood Shipping Private." It was the perfect place for a crime to be completed. Clara approached the warehouse with her back pressed against the cold metal. She moved with the silence she had mastered during her weeks of shadow work. She reached a side door that had been left slightly open, the rusted hinges groaning quietly in the wind. She slipped inside, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The interior was a vast cavern, filled with rows of wooden crates that reached toward a ceiling lost in the shadows. The only light came from a small yellow bulb hanging over a metal desk at the far end of the warehouse. Standing near the desk was Sebastian. He had discarded his expensive blue jacket, and his silk shirt was damp with sweat despite the cold. Next to him was a man in a dark uniform, a man Clara recognized as one of the officers who had arrested Julian. They weren't enemies, they were partners. Sebastian was laughing, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed through the empty space. He was holding a heavy metal briefcase open on the desk. Inside, Clara could see stacks of leather-bound books and loose pages, the secret records of the Blackwood estate. These were the documents Julian had protected for years, the ones that held the history of the legacy. Clara pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen was cracked and the battery was dangerously low, but it was enough. She opened the recording app and held the phone steady, her fingers trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. She leaned forward, hiding behind a stack of crates that smelled of old cedar and dust. Sebastian pulled a silver pen from his pocket, the same pen he had used to forge the signatures. He began to flip through the ledgers, tearing out pages and tossing them into a small metal drum where a fire was burning. The black pages that Julian had written with silver ink were curling into ash, their secrets disappearing into the smoke. "It's almost beautiful, isn't it?" Sebastian said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Julian spent his whole life hiding in the dark, writing his little secrets on black paper. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the name Blackwood meant something. He didn't realize that in this city, a name is only as strong as the man who can pay for the truth. The officer leaned against the desk, lighting a cigarette. "The judge is already on the payroll, Sebastian. Julian will be moved to the private facility by morning. He won't be allowed any visitors, and he certainly won't be allowed to speak to the press. As far as the world is concerned, the Ice King has finally shattered. You're the hero who stepped in to save the company. And the girl? Sebastian asked, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire. The housekeeper? She saw too much. She's a nobody, the officer replied with a shrug. If she shows her face, we'll pick her up for trespassing and theft. We've already placed some of the family silver in her room. No one will listen to a girl who looks like she crawled out of a gutter. Clara's blood ran cold. They had planned everything. They hadn't just framed Julian, they had prepared a cage for her too. But she kept the phone held high. She captured every word, every laugh, and every toss of a black page into the fire. She had the confession. She had the names. She had the proof that would burn Sebastian's world to the ground. Suddenly, the phone in her hand gave a soft, electronic beep, a warning that the battery was at 1%. The sound was tiny, but in the vast, echoing warehouse, it was like a bell. Sebastian froze. He looked toward the shadows where Clara was hiding. Who's there? Clara didn't wait. She turned and began to run. Get her. Sebastian screamed, his voice cracking with panic. That's the girl. Don't let her leave this warehouse. The chase began. Clara sprinted through the maze of crates, her footsteps sounding like thunder on the concrete floor. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of the officer's boots and the frantic shouting of Sebastian. She reached the main sliding door, but it was locked from the outside. She turned and ran toward the back of the building, toward the loading docks that opened directly onto the water. She burst through a set of double doors and found herself on a narrow wooden pier. The black fog was so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. The ocean was a dark, churning mass below, the waves crashing against the wooden beams with a violent force. To her left was a row of giant shipping containers, stacked 3 stories high like metal mountains. Clara. Sebastian's voice called out from the darkness. He sounded closer now. Give me the phone and I'll make it all go away. I'll give you enough money to take your mother to Europe. I'll make you rich. You don't have to be a shadow anymore. Clara didn't answer. She climbed onto a rusted metal ladder on the side of a blue shipping container. She climbed as fast as she could, her hands slipping on the wet rungs. When she reached the top, she looked down. She saw the yellow beams of their flashlights cutting through the fog, searching for her. She moved across the tops of the containers, jumping from one to the other. Below her, she heard the men cursing as they tried to follow her. She reached the very edge of the pier, where a massive crane stood silent and still. She had nowhere left to go. She looked at her phone. The recording was saved. She had one chance. She opened her email and hit send to a contact she had found in Julian's desk earlier, a private investigator Julian had been paying in secret. She watched the loading bar. 10%, 20%. There she is, the officer yelled. He was at the bottom of the ladder, his gun drawn. Clara stood on the edge of the metal container, the freezing wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked down at the dark water and then at the phone. 90%, 99%. The phone screen flickered and went black. It was dead. But as the screen went dark, a small green checkmark had appeared. The email was sent. The truth was out of her hands and into the world. Clara looked at Sebastian, who had reached the top of the neighboring container. He looked disheveled, his eyes wide with a mixture of greed and terror. He reached out a hand, his voice a desperate whisper. Give it to me, Clara. You're just a housekeeper. You can't win this. Clara stood tall, a cold smile touching her lips for the first time. I'm not just a housekeeper, Sebastian, she said, her voice steady and clear against the roar of the ocean. I'm the person who cleans up the mess. And tonight, the mess is you. Without another word, she stepped back into the black fog. She didn't fall into the water. She dropped onto a lower ledge she had spotted earlier, a small platform used by the crane operators. She vanished into the mist before Sebastian could even move. She ran through the darkness of the docks, her heart light with a strange kind of peace. She had no money, no phone, and she was miles away from home. But as she heard the distant approaching sound of real sirens, sirens that hadn't been bought by Sebastian, she knew the Ice King was about to be set free. The docks chase was over, but the final secret of the Blackwood family was about to be revealed. The first light of dawn was not black or gray. It was a pale, hesitant gold that finally managed to break through the Seattle fog. The docks were no longer a maze of terror, but a crime scene buzzing with the activity of honest men. As the real authorities took Sebastian away in the back of a black sedan, his screams for a lawyer were drowned out by the sound of the rising tide. Clara stood on the pier, her thin coat wrapped tightly around her, watching the sun reflect off the water. She was exhausted, her arm was bleeding from the glass she had jumped through, and her phone was a dead piece of plastic in her pocket. But for the first time in her life, she felt as though she was standing on solid ground. The police had processed the digital recording she had sent. The evidence of the forgery, the conspiracy, and the corruption of the local officers was undeniable. Julian Blackwood was released from the psychiatric facility within hours. He didn't go to a hotel and he didn't go to his office downtown. He came straight to the docks. When his car pulled up, the silence returned to the pier. Julian stepped out, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning sun. He was still wearing the black suit, now wrinkled and stained from his night in a cell, and the red scarf was still tied firmly around his hand. He walked toward Clara, his gray eyes no longer icy, but filled with a profound, quiet intensity. He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The billionaire and the housekeeper, two people who had found each other in the dark. Julian reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small yellowed envelope. It wasn't one of the black pages he had been writing on. It was an old piece of stationery, worn at the edges from years of being touched. "I found this in my father's private vault this morning," Julian said, his voice low and thick with emotion. Sebastian was looking for money and power, but he missed the only thing that actually mattered in that safe. He missed the truth. He handed the envelope to Clara. Inside was an old photograph and a letter. The photograph showed a younger version of Julian's father standing next to a man with a kind smile and eyes that were identical to Clara's. They were standing on these very docks 20 years ago. The man next to Julian's father was wearing a simple suit and a badge that read, "Blackwood Security." Clara's breath hitched. "That's my father," she whispered. "My mother always told me he died in an industrial accident here. She never told me who he worked for. She said the memory was too painful." Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on the photograph. "It wasn't an accident, Clara. It was a choice. 20 years ago, on this very pier, there was an attempt on my father's life. A rival company wanted to end the Blackwood line before it could grow. They had rigged a crane to drop a heavy steel container on our car while we were driving through the yard. I was only a boy sitting in the back seat." He stepped closer, his voice trembling. "Your father, David Vance, was our lead bodyguard. He saw the crane move before anyone else did. He didn't call out a warning. He didn't run for cover. He threw himself into the path of the container, using his own body to push our car out of the way. He saved my father. He saved me. But he never made it out." Clara felt the tears finally spilling over, hot and fast against the cold morning air. She looked at the man in the photo, the hero she had never truly known. "My father spent the rest of his life trying to find you," Julian continued. "He wanted to make sure David's family was taken care of, but in the chaos of the investigation and the loss of the records, the trail went cold. When I hired you, I didn't know who you were. I saw a girl who was desperate and silent, and I thought you were just another shadow. But when I saw you look at that family painting, and when you bound my hand with that red scarf, I felt something I hadn't felt since that day on the docks. I felt safe. Julian took Clara's hand, the one that wasn't injured. Your father gave his life so that I could have mine. And last night you gave everything you had to save me again. The debt the Blackwood family owes you can never be repaid with money, Clara. You are the reason I am still standing. The revelation changed everything. The shadow work hadn't been a coincidence. The attraction to the black pages and the silence of the mansion wasn't just madness. It was a search for a lost connection. Julian realized that his obsession with the past wasn't a prison, but a path that had led him back to the daughter of the man who had saved him. The ending of the story was not one of gold and towers, but of healing. Julian used his influence to clear his father's old records and officially recognized David Vance's sacrifice. A monument was built at the docks, a simple stone pillar that stood against the fog, ensuring that the name Vance would never be forgotten again. Clara's mother was moved to the best medical facility in the country. With the best doctors and the warmth of a life without fear, her cough vanished and her strength returned. They didn't go back to the damp apartment or the threat of eviction. They lived in a beautiful cottage on the sunnier side of the Blackwood estate, a place where the pine trees didn't hiss, but sang in the wind. Julian Blackwood was no longer the Ice King. He opened the mansion to the light, tearing down the heavy velvet curtains and burning the black pages. He kept only the silver pen and the red scarf. He began to run the Blackwood Empire not with the coldness of a machine, but with the heart of a man who knew the value of a single life. One evening, as the sun was setting over the Pacific, casting a long golden road across the water, Clara and Julian stood at the screaming iron gate. It didn't scream anymore. Julian had personally oiled the hinges until they moved in silence. "The fog is coming in again," Clara said, looking toward the horizon. Julian smiled, a real warm smile that reached his gray eyes. He took her hand, the red scarf still tied around his palm as a permanent reminder of the day the ice broke. "Let it come," Julian replied. "We've learned how to find each other in the dark. The fog can't hide us anymore." As they walked back toward the mansion, the light of the house was visible from miles away. It was no longer a fortress or a tomb. It was a lighthouse. Clara Vance, the girl who had arrived with nothing but a bus ticket, had found something more valuable than any billionaire's fortune. She had found her father's legacy, she had found her mother's health, and she had found a man who had finally learned that the most powerful thing in the world isn't the shadows we hide in, but the light we share with those who save us. The story of the Blackwood estate was no longer written in silver ink on black paper. It was written in the sunlight, and for the first time in 20 years, the sun was never going to set.